Hello. 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 Welcome to Storytime with Moog. I am Moog, and today we are reading Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, starting with Part 6, Chapter 29. But first, let's just do it. I am just like raring to go because I know we said last time that we were going to finish part 6, but this time we really are going to finish part 6. But really, truly this time. So today we're starting with part 6, chapter 29. There's 32 chapters in part 6. So we will finish. That's only 4 chapters, and then we can move on to part 7, which I am just hoping, with all of the hope that I have, that it is not as boring as part 6. So, to recap what happened last time, which wasn't the most boring part. Actually, it was more exciting, but also at the same time more of the same. In that, we were with Anna Karenina, we were with Vronsky, and Daria was there as well, visiting. And Vronsky is building a hospital. So they go on this tour to show off the hospital, the progress, all of these things. And as they're going back to the house, Vronsky pulls aside Daria and is like, hey girl, you're friends with Anna. Convince her to ask her husband for a divorce. Okay, thanks, bye. And so Daria has a conversation with Anna, and Anna is like, oh, woe is me. If I do this, this is going to happen. If I don't do this, this is going to happen. Which we have heard her going back and forth with basically the same arguments. The only tiny little addition is future children, not just about the 2 children that she has now, but what is going to happen with her future children that she has, if she has, with Vronsky. I think that's it. And then, what's her face? Daria goes back home to Levin. So, I think that's where we ended. Oh, that's not all that happened last time. We had a lot of politics. That's what that is also. There's like this huge vote that's happening. So we got from Levin's perspective, not from Vronsky, even though Vronsky also went, not from Zviashki, even though Zviashki also went. We got from Levin's perspective 6 days of this like process of voting for these specific things and all this red tape and everything that happened. And I think that's where it ended. And when I say that, I am looking at the end of the last chapter. And I still think that that's all that happened. Part 6, Chapter 29. The narrow room in which they were smoking and taking refreshments was full of noblemen. The excitement grew more intense, and every face betrayed some uneasiness. The excitement was especially keen for the leaders of each party, who knew every detail and had reckoned up every vote. They were the generals organizing the approaching battle. The rest, like the rank and file before an engagement, though they were getting ready for the fight, sought for other distractions in the interval. Some were lunching, standing at the bar or sitting at the table. Others were walking up and down the long room, smoking cigarettes and talking with friends whom they had not seen for a long while. Levin did not care to eat, and he was not smoking. He did not want to join his own friends, that is, Sergei Ivanovich, Stepan Arkadyevich, Zviashki, and the rest, because Vronsky, in his equerry's uniform, was standing with them in eager conversation. Levin had seen him already at the meeting on the previous day, and he had studiously avoided him, not caring to greet him. He went to the window and sat down, scanning the groups and listening to what was being said around him. He felt depressed, especially because everyone else was, as he saw, eager, anxious, and interested. and he, alone, with an old, toothless little man with mumbling lips wearing a naval uniform sitting beside him, had no interest in it, and nothing to do. He's such a blackguard. I have told him so, but it makes no difference. Only think of it. He couldn't collect it in 3 years. He heard vigorously uttered by a round-shouldered, short country gentleman who had pomaded hair hanging on his embroidered collar, and new boots, obviously put on for the occasion, with heels that tapped energetically as he spoke. Casting a displeased glance at Levin, this gentleman sharply turned his back. "Yes, it's a dirty business. There's no denying," the small gentleman assented in a high voice. Next, a whole crowd of country gentlemen, surrounding a stout general, hurriedly came near Levin. These persons were unmistakably seeking a place where they could talk without being overheard. "How dare he say I had his breeches stolen? Pawned them for drink, I expect. Damn the fellow. Prince, indeed. He'd better not say it, the beast." "But excuse me, they take their stand on the act," was being said in another group. "The wife must be registered as noble." "Damn your axe, I speak from my heart. We're all gentlemen, aren't we? Above suspicion." "Shall we go, Your Excellency? Fine champagne." Another group was following a nobleman who was shouting something in a loud voice. It was one of the 3 intoxicated gentlemen. "I always advised Marya Semyonovna to let for a fair rent, for she can never save a profit," he heard a pleasant voice say. The speaker was a country gentleman with gray whiskers, wearing the regimental uniform of an old general staff officer. It was the very landowner Levin had met at Zviashki's. He knew him at once. The landowner, too, stared at Levin, and they exchanged greetings. "Oh, very glad to see you. To be sure, I remember you very well, last year, at our district marshal, Nikolai Ivanovitch's." "Well, and how is your land doing?" asked Levin. Still just the same, always at a loss," the landowner answered with a resigned smile, but with an expression of serenity and conviction that so it must be. "And how do you come to be in our province?" he asked. "Come to take part in our coup d'etat?" he said, confidently pronouncing the French words with a bad accent. "All Russia's here, gentlemen of the bedchamber, and everything short of the ministry." He pointed to the imposing figure of Stepan Arkadyevitch in white trousers and his court uniform, walking by with a general. "I ought to own that I don't very well understand the drift of the provincial elections," said Levin. The landowner looked at him. "Why, what is there to understand? There's no meaning in it at all. It's a decaying institution that goes on running only by the force of inertia. Just look, the very uniforms tell you that it's an assembly of justices of the peace, permanent members of the court, and so on, but not of noblemen." "Then why do you come?" asked Levin. "From habit, nothing else. Then, too, one must keep up connections. It's a moral obligation of a sort. And then, to tell the truth, there's one's own interests. My son-in-law wants to stand as a permanent member. They're not rich, and he must be brought forward. These gentlemen, now, what do they come for?" he said, pointing to the malignant gentleman who was talking at the high table. "That's the new generation of nobility." "New it may be, but nobility it isn't. They're proprietors of a sort, but we're the landowners. As noblemen, they're cutting their own throats." "But you say it's an institution that's served its time." "It may be, but still it ought to be treated a little more respectfully. Snetkov, now, we may be of use, or we may not, but we're the growth of 1,000 years. If we're laying out a garden, planting one before the house, you know, and there you've a tree that's stood for centuries in the very spot, old and gnarled it may be, and yet you don't cut down the old fellow to make room for the flower beds. but lay out your beds so as to take advantage of the tree. You won't grow him again in a year, he said cautiously, and he immediately changed the conversation. Well, and how is your land doing? Oh, not very well. I make 5%. Yes, but you don't reckon your own worth. Aren't you worth something too? I'll tell you my own case. Before I took to seeing after the land, I had a salary of £300 from the service. Now I do more work than I did in the service, and like you, I get 5% on the land, and thank God for that. But one's work is thrown in for nothing. Then why do you do it, if it's a clear loss? Oh, well, one does it. What would you have? It's habit, and one knows it's how it should be, and what's more, the landowner went on, leaning his elbows on the window and chatting on, my son, I must tell you, has no taste for it. There's no doubt he'll be a scientific man, so there'll be no one to keep it up. And yet one does. Here this year I've planted an orchard. Yes, said Levin. That's perfectly true. I always feel there's no real balance of gain in my work on the land, and yet one does it. It's a sort of duty one feels to the land. But I tell you what, the landowner pursued. A neighbor of mine, a merchant, was at my place. We walked about the fields and the garden. No, said he, Stepan Vasilievich, everything's well looked after, but your garden's neglected. But as a fact, it's well kept up. To my thinking, I'd cut down that lime tree. Here's your thousands of limes, and each would make 2 good bundles of bark, and nowadays that bark's worth something. I'd cut down the lot. And with what he made, he'd increase his stock, or buy some land for a trifle, and let it out in lots of the peasants, Levin added, smiling. He had evidently more than once come across those commercial calculations. And he'd make his fortune. But you and I must thank God if we keep what we've got and leave it to our children. You're married, I've heard, said the landowner. Yes, Levin answered with proud satisfaction. Yes, it's rather strange, he went on. So we live without making anything, as though we were ancient vestals set to keep in a fire. The landowner chuckled under his white mustaches. There are some among us, too, like our friend Nikolai Ivanovich or Count Vronsky, that's settled here lately, who try to carry on their husbandry as though it were a factory, but so far it leads to nothing but making away with capital on it. But why is it we don't do like the merchants? Why don't we cut down our parks for timber? Said Levin, returning to a thought that had struck him. Why? As you said, to keep the fire in. Besides, that's not work for a nobleman, and our work as noblemen isn't done here at the elections, but yonder, each in our corner. There's a class instinct, too, of what one ought and oughtn't to do. There's the peasants, too. I wonder at them sometimes. Any good peasant tries to take all the land he can, however bad the land is. He'll work it. Without a return, too, at a simple loss. Just as we do, said Levin. Very, very glad to have met you, he added, seeing Zviashki approaching him. And here we've met for the first time since we met at your place, said the landowner to Zviashki, and we've had a good talk, too. Well, have you been attacking the new order of things? Said Zviashki with a smile. That we're bound to do. You've relieved your feelings? End of chapter 29. All right, Levin. Of course, we had to go back to Levin before we ended part 6, which has not been my favorite part. So we're back with Levin, and it is like a mingling situation, but there's so many people that Levin doesn't really want to talk to at all. And he's not really part of, like, the political circles that, like, Zviashki is part of. So, and he doesn't really want to talk to Vronsky either. He sees him from afar. He's like, not today. So instead, he's talking to another landowner who he had met before at Zviashki's. And they are talking, yes, politics, but very specifically about politics and being a landowner and what that means for noblemen versus people working the land versus peasants versus like the lords of the land, like those types of things. So, typical Levin, just talking about his land and labor. Chapter 30. Zviashki took Levin's arm and went with him to his own friends. This time there was no avoiding Vronsky. He was standing with Stepan Arkadyevitch and Sergei Ivanovitch and looking straight at Levin as he drew near. "Delighted. I believe I've had the pleasure of meeting you at Princess Sherbatskoy's," he said, giving Levin his hand. "Yes, I quite remember our meeting," said Levin, and blushing crimson, he turned away immediately and began talking to his brother. With a slight smile, Vronsky went on talking to Zviashki, obviously without the slightest inclination to enter into conversation with Levin. But Levin, as he talked to his brother, was continually looking round at Vronsky, trying to think of something to say to him to gloss over his rudeness. "What are we waiting for now?" asked Levin, looking at Zviashki and Vronsky. "For Snetkov. He has to refuse or to consent to stand," answered Zviashki. "Well, and what has he done, consented or not?" "That's the point, that he's done neither," said Vronsky. "And if he refuses, who will stand then?" asked Levin, looking at Vronsky. "Whoever chooses to," said Zviashki. "Shall you?" asked Levin. "Certainly not I," said Zviashki, looking confused and turning an alarmed glance at the malignant gentleman who was standing beside Sergei Ivanovitch. "Who then?" "Nevyedoyevsky," said Levin, feeling he was putting his foot into it. But this was worse still. Nevyedoyevsky and Zviashki were the two candidates. "I certainly shall not, under any circumstance," answered the malignant gentleman. This was Nevyedoyevsky himself. Zviashki introduced him to Levin. "Well, you find it exciting, too," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, winking at Vronsky. "It's something like a race. One might bet on it." "Yes, it is keenly exciting," said Vronsky. "And once taking the thing up, one's eager to see it through. It's a fight," he said, scowling and setting his powerful jaws. "What a capable fellow Zviashki is. Sees it all so clearly." "Oh, yes," Vronsky assented indifferently. A silence followed, during which Vronsky, since he had to look at something, looked at Levin, at his feet, at his uniform, then at his face, and nothing his gloomy eyes fixed upon him, he said, in order to say something, "How is it that you, living constantly in the country, are not a justice of the peace? You are not in the uniform of one." "It's because I consider that the justice of the peace is a silly institution," Levin answered gloomily. He had been all the time looking for an opportunity to enter into conversation with Vronsky so as to smooth over his rudeness at their first meeting. "I don't think so. Quite the contrary," Vronsky said with quiet surprise. "It's a plaything," Levin cut him short. "We don't want justices of the peace. I've never had a single thing to do with them during 8 years, and what I have had was decided wrongly by them. The justice of the peace is over 30 miles from me. For some matter of 2 rubles, I should have to send a lawyer, who costs me 15. And he related how a peasant had stolen some flour from the miller, and when the miller told him of it, had lodged a complaint for slander. All this was utterly uncalled for and stupid, and Levin felt it himself as he said it. "This is such an original fellow," said Stepan Arkadyevitch with his most soothing, almond oil smile. "But come along, I think they're voting." And they separated. "I can't understand," said Sergei Ivanovitch, who had observed his brother's clumsiness. "I can't understand how anyone can be so absolutely devoid of political tact. That's where we Russians are so deficient. The marshal of the province is our opponent, and with him your ami cochon, and you beg him to stand. Count Vronsky. Now, I'm not making a friend of him. He's asked me to dinner, and I'm not going. But he's one of our side. Why make an enemy of him? Then you ask Nevyadoivsky if he's going to stand. It's not a thing to do. Oh, I don't understand it at all. And it's all such nonsense, Levin answered gloomily. You say it's all such nonsense, but as soon as you have anything to do with it, you make a muddle. Levin did not answer, and they walked together into the big room. The marshal of the province, though he was vaguely conscious in the air of some trap being prepared for him, and though he had not been called upon by all to stand, had still made up his mind to stand. All was silence in the room. The secretary announced in a loud voice that the captain of the guards, Mikhail Stepanovich Snetkov, would now be balloted for as marshal of the province. The district marshals walked, carrying plates on which were balls, from their tables to the high table, and the election began. Put it in the right side, whispered Stepan Arkadyevich, as with him his brother Levin followed the marshal of his district to the table. But Levin had forgotten by now the calculations that had been explained to him, and was afraid Stepan Arkadyevich might be mistaken in saying the right side. Surely Snetkov was the enemy. As he went up, he held the ball in his right hand, but thinking he was wrong, just at the box, he changed to the left hand, and undoubtedly put the ball to the left. An adept in the business, standing at the box and seeing by the mere action of the elbow where each put his ball, scowled with annoyance. It was no good for him to use his insight. Everything was still, and the counting of the balls was heard. Then a single voice rose and proclaimed the numbers for and against. The marshal had been voted for by a considerable majority. All was noise and eager movement towards the doors. Snetkov came in, and the nobles thronged round him, congratulating him. Well, now is it over? Levin asked Sergei Ivanovich. It's only just the beginning, Sviashki said, replying for Sergei Ivanovich with a smile. Some other candidate may receive more votes than the marshal. Levin had quite forgotten about that. Now he could only remember that there was some sort of trickery in it, but he was too bored to think what it was exactly. He felt depressed, and longed to get out of the crowd. As no one was paying any attention to him, and no one apparently needed him, he quietly slipped away into the little room where the refreshments were, and again had a great sense of comfort when he saw the waiters. The little old waiter pressed him to have something, and Levin agreed. After eating a cutlet with beans and talking to the waiters of their former masters, Levin, not wishing to go back to the hall where it was all so distasteful to him, proceeded to walk through the galleries. The galleries were full of fashionably dressed ladies, leaning over the balustrade and trying not to lose a single word of what was being said below. With the ladies were sitting and standing smart lawyers, high school teachers in spectacles, and officers. Everywhere they were talking of the election, and of how worried the marshal was, and how splendid the discussions had been. In one group, Levin heard his brother's praises. One lady was telling a lawyer, "How glad I am I heard Koznishev. It's worth losing one's dinner. He's exquisite, so clear and distinct, all of it. There's not one of you in the law courts that speaks like that. The only one is Madel, and he's not so eloquent by a long way." Finding a free place, Levin leaned over the balustrade and began looking and listening. All the noblemen were sitting railed off behind barriers according to their districts. In the middle of the room stood a man in a uniform, who shouted in a loud, high voice, "As a candidate for the marshalship of the nobility of the province, we call upon Staff Captain Yevgeny Ivanovich Aputin. A dead silence followed, and then a weak, old voice was heard. Declined. We call upon the Privy Councillor, Pyotr Petrovich Bol. The voice began again. Declined, a high, boyish voice replied. And again it began, and again declined, and so it went on for about an hour. Levin, with his elbows on the balustrade, looked and listened. At first he wondered and wanted to know what it meant. Then, feeling sure that he could not make it out, he began to be bored. Then, recalling all the excitement and vindictiveness he had seen on all the faces, he felt sad. He made up his mind to go and went downstairs. As he passed through the entry to the galleries, he met a dejected high school boy walking up and down with tired-looking eyes. On the stairs he met a couple, a lady running quickly on her high heels and the jaunty deputy prosecutor. I told you we weren't late, the deputy prosecutor was saying at the moment when Levin moved aside to let the lady pass. Levin was on the stairs to the way out and was just feeling in his waistcoat pocket for the number of his overcoat when the secretary overtook him. This way, please, Konstantin Dmitrievich. They are voting. The candidate who was being voted on was Nevyodovsky, who had so stoutly denied all idea of standing. Levin went up to the door of the room. It was locked. The secretary knocked, the door opened, and Levin was met by two red-faced gentlemen who darted out. I can't stand any more of it, said one red-faced gentleman. After them, the face of the marshal of the province was poked out. His face was dreadful looking, from exhaustion and dismay. I told you not to let anyone out, he cried to the doorkeeper. I let someone in, Your Excellency. Mercy on us. And with a heavy sigh, the marshal of the province walked with downcast head to the high table in the middle of the room, his legs staggering in his white trousers. Nevyodovsky had scored a higher majority as they had planned, and he was the new marshal of the province. Many people were amused. Many were pleased and happy. Many were in ecstasies. Many were disgusted and unhappy. The formal marshal of the province was in a state of despair, which he could not conceal. When Nevyodovsky went out of the room, the crowd thronged round him and followed him enthusiastically, just as they had followed the governor who had opened the meetings, and just as they had followed Snetkov when he was elected. End of chapter 30. All right. Chapter 30. We're still hanging out with Levin, and I feel I'm not going to say this very often, but I feel like we are Levin. In that all of this politics, all of these political discussions, all of these votes are happening, and we are just feeling out of our depth with them. Everything was explained to us and Levin in previous chapters, and we know that something has to happen in order for something to happen, and if this happens, then this has to happen. And like Levin, we just don't remember. I mean, maybe we do. I don't remember. And so even when Levin is going up to vote, he thinks that he's supposed to be voting left. And Stepan Arkadyevich is like, put it in the right. And Levin is like, well, that can't be right. Because what they said before, and he just gets confused. And so he votes left. And so now he is just wandering around, not really knowing what to do, and then somebody catches him as he's about to leave and pulls him into the room, and he's like, the vote's about to happen. And that's where we are. And so the vote is happening, and things are happening. But Levin, and at least me, I am not like a huge, political drama reader, so like I'm not following exactly what's going on. But neither is Levin, so that makes me feel like a little bit better. But that's where we are. That's where we are. All right. Chapter 31. The newly elected marshal and many of the successful party dined that day with Vronsky. Vronsky had come to the elections partly because he was bored in the country and wanted to show Anna his right to independence, and also to repay Zviashki by his support at the election for all the trouble he had taken for Vronsky at the district council election. But chiefly, in order strictly to perform all those duties of a nobleman and landowner which he had taken upon himself. But he had not in the least expected that the election would so interest him, so keenly excite him, and that he would be so good at this kind of thing. He was quite a new man in the circle of nobility of the province, but his success was unmistakable, and he was not wrong in supposing that he had already obtained a certain influence. This influence was due to his wealth and reputation. The capital house in the town lent him by his old friend Shirkov, who had a post in the Department of Finances and was director of a flourishing bank in Kashin. The excellent cook Vronsky had brought from the country, and his friendship with the governor, who was a schoolfellow of Vronsky's. A schoolfellow he had patronized and protected, indeed. But what contributed more than all to his success was his direct, equable manner with everyone, which very quickly made the majority of the noblemen reverse the current opinion of his supposed haughtiness. He was himself conscious that, except that whimsical gentleman married to Kitty Sherbatskoy, who had, apropos de beau, poured out a stream of irrelevant absurdities with such spiteful fury, every nobleman with whom he had made acquaintance had become his adherent. He saw clearly, and other people recognized it too, that he had done a great deal to secure the success of Nevyadoivsky, and now at his own table celebrating Nevyadoivsky's election, he was experiencing an agreeable sense of triumph over the success of his candidate. The election itself had so fascinated him that if he could succeed in getting married during the next 3 years, he began to think of standing himself, much as after winning a race ridden by a jockey, he had longed to ride a race himself. Today he was celebrating the success of his jockey. Vronsky sat at the head of the table. On his right hand sat the young governor, a general of high rank. To all the rest he was the chief man in the province, who had solemnly opened the election with his speech, and aroused a feeling of respect and even of awe in many people, as Vronsky saw. To Vronsky, he was little Katka Maslov, that had been his nickname in the page's corps, whom he felt to be shy and tried to mettre à son aise. On the left hand sat Nevyadoivsky, with his youthful, stubborn, and malignant face. With him, Vronsky was simple and deferential. Zviashki took his failure very lightheartedly. It was indeed no failure in his eyes, as he said himself, turning, glass in hand, to Nevyadoivsky. They could not have found a better representative of the new movement, which the nobility ought to follow. And so every honest person, as he said, was on the side of today's success and was rejoicing over it. Stepan Arkadyevitch was glad, too, that he was having a good time and that everyone was pleased. The episode of the elections served as a good occasion for a capital dinner. Zviashki comically imitated the tearful discourse of the marshal and observed, addressing Nevyadoivsky, that His Excellency would have to select another, more complicated method of auditing the accounts than tears. Another nobleman jocosely described how footmen in stockings had been ordered for the marshal's ball, and how now they would have to be sent back unless the new marshal would give a ball with footmen in stockings. Continually during dinner, they said of Nevyadoivsky, "Our marshal," and "Your Excellency." This was said with the same pleasure with which a bride is called Madam, and her husband's name. Nevyedovsky affected to be not merely indifferent, but scornful of this appellation, but it was obvious that he was highly delighted, and had to keep a curb on himself, not to betray the triumph which was unsuitable to their new liberal tone. After dinner, several telegrams were sent to people interested in the result of the election, and Stepan Arkadyevitch, who was in high good humor, sent Darya Alexandrovna a telegram. Nevyedovsky elected by 20 votes. Congratulations. Tell people. He dictated it aloud, saying, "We must let them share our rejoicing." Darya Alexandrovna, getting the message, simply sighed over the ruble wasted on it, and understood that it was an after-dinner affair. She knew Stiva had a weakness after dinner for faire your le télégraphe, everything. Together with the excellent dinner and the wine, not from French merchants, but imported direct from abroad, was extremely dignified, simple, and enjoyable. The party, some 20, had been selected by Zviashki from among the more active new liberals, all of the same way of thinking, who were at the same time clever and well-bred. They drank, also half in jest, to the health of the new marshal of the province, of the governor, of the bank director, and of our most amiable host. Vronsky was satisfied. He had never expected to find so pleasant a tone in the provinces. Towards the end of dinner it was still more lively. The governor asked Vronsky to come to a concert for the benefit of the Servians, which his wife, who was anxious to make his acquaintance, had been getting up. "There'll be a ball, and you'll see the belle of the province. Worth seeing, really." "Not in my line," Vronsky answered. He liked that English phrase, but he smiled and promised to come. Before they rose from the table, when all of them were smoking, Vronsky's valet went up to him with a letter on a tray. "From home, by a special messenger," he said with a significant expression. "Astonishing how like he is to the deputy prosecutor Zventetsky," said one of the guests in French of the valet, while Vronsky, frowning, read the letter. The letter was from Anna. Before he read the letter, he knew its contents. Expecting the elections to be over in 5 days, he had promised to be back on Friday. Today was Saturday, and he knew that the letter contained reproaches for not being back at the time fixed. The letter he had sent the previous evening had probably not reached her yet. The letter was what he had expected, but the form of it was unexpected and particularly disagreeable to him. "Annie is very ill. The doctor says it may be inflammation. I am losing my head all alone. Princess Varvara is no help, but a hindrance. I expected you the day before yesterday, and now I am sending to find out where you are and what you are doing. I wanted to come myself, but thought better of it, knowing you would dislike it. Send some answer, that I may know what to do." The child, ill. Yet she had thought of coming herself. Their daughter, ill. And this hostile tone. The innocent festivities over the election and this gloomy, burdensome love to which he had to return struck Vronsky by their contrast. He had to go, and by the first train that night, he set off home. End of chapter 31. Okay, chapter 31. Now we have switched from Levin to Vronsky. They're at the same gathering, they're at the same dinner, but now we're getting a different perspective. And Levin, who is just confused and befuddled and doesn't really know what's going on, and yes, there's a lot of, things happening, and it has been really heated before, and so he's like kind of here for that, and the vibes more than anything. Vronsky also super loving the vibes, but is also loving all of the politics and all of the different things that go with the politics, the voting, the whole process, everything. And he compares it to horse racing, which we've seen him do previously, and, you know, comparing the different members as being jockeys and, you know, being like, the one that I bet on will win, like that sort of thing. And so he's enjoying himself. He's having a great time. And then he gets a letter from Anna, and the letter basically says, our poor little baby Annie is sick. Where are you? You were supposed to be here after 5 days. You haven't come home. I haven't heard from you. Help. I can't do this by myself. The person that I'm with, Princess Varvara, is actually making things worse instead of helping. So now Vronsky is struck with, yes, my home life. And my home life is not amazing, not everything that I hoped and wanted it to be. And so, like, this little escape that he had into the world of politics, and then it being, you know, immediately compared to his home life of it being like, yes, Anna and all of her wants, and Anna and all of her needs and her emotions and all of these things and her drama. And also our kid is sick. And that's where that chapter ended. So we're getting with this some interesting setup, and I am curious to see where it's gonna go. I'm wondering if we're gonna get like a little, I mean, we'll keep reading today, but at the end of part 6, we have one more chapter in part 6. I'm wondering if we're gonna get like a little, like, cliffhanger. I don't know. I guess we should read and find out. Let's do it. Chapter 32. Before Vronsky's departure for the elections, Anna had reflected that the scenes constantly repeated between them each time he left home might only make him cold to her instead of attaching him to her, and resolved to do all she could to control herself so as to bear the parting with composure. But the cold, severe glance with which he had looked at her when he came to tell her he was going had wounded her, and before he had started, her peace of mind was destroyed. In solitude afterwards, thinking over that glance which had expressed his right to freedom, she came, as she always did, to the same point, the sense of her own humiliation. He has the right to go away when and where he chooses. Not simply to go away, but to leave me. He has every right, and I have none. But knowing that, he ought not to do it. What has he done, though? He looked at me with a cold, severe expression. Of course, that is something indefinable, impalpable, but it has never been so before, and that glance means a great deal, she thought. That glance shows the beginning of indifference. And though she felt sure that a coldness was beginning, there was nothing she could do. She could not in any way alter her relation to him. Just as before, only by love and by charm could she keep him. And so, just as before, only by occupation in the day, by morphine at night, could she stifle the fearful thought of what would be if he ceased to love her. It is true, there was still one means not to keep him. For that she wanted nothing more than his love, but to be nearer to him, to be in such a position that he would not leave her. That means was divorce and marriage. And she began to long for that, and made up her mind to agree to it the first time he or Stiva approached her on the subject. Absorbed in such thoughts, she passed 5 days without him, the 5 days that he was to be at the elections. Walks, conversation with Princess Varvara, visits to the hospital, and most of all, reading. Reading of one book after another filled up her time. But on the 6th day, when the coachman came back without him, she felt that now she was utterly incapable of stifling the thought of him and of what he was doing there. Just at that time, her little girl was taken ill, Anna began to look after her, but even that did not distract her mind, especially as the illness was not serious. However hard she tried, she could not love this little child, and to feign love was beyond her powers. Towards the evening of that day, still alone, Anna was in such a panic about him that she decided to start for the town, but on second thoughts, wrote him the contradictory letter that Vronsky received, and without reading it through, sent it off by a special messenger. The next morning she received his letter and regretted her own. She dreaded a repetition of the severe look he had flung at her at parting, especially when he knew that the baby was not dangerously ill. But still, she was glad she had written to him. At this moment, Anna was positively admitting to herself that she was a burden to him, that he would relinquish his freedom regretfully to return to her, and in spite of that, she was glad he was coming. To let him weary of her, but he would be here with her, so that she would see him, would know of every action he took. She was sitting in the drawing room near a lamp with a new volume of Taine, and as she read, listening to the sound of the wind outside, and every minute expecting the carriage to arrive. Several times she had fancied she heard the sound of wheels, but she had been mistaken. At last she heard not the sound of wheels, but the coachman's shout and the dull rumble in the covered entry. Even Princess Varvara, playing patience, confirmed this, and Anna, flushing hotly, got up. But instead of going down, as she had done twice before, she stood still. She suddenly felt ashamed of her duplicity, but even more she dreaded how he might meet her. All feeling of wounded pride had passed now. She was only afraid of the expression of his displeasure. She remembered that her child had been perfectly well again for the past 2 days. She felt positively vexed with her for getting better from the very moment her letter was sent off. Then she thought of him, that he was here, all of him, with his hands, his eyes. She heard his voice, and forgetting everything, she ran joyfully to meet him. "Well, how is Annie?" he said, timidly from below, looking up to Anna as she ran down to him. He was sitting on a chair, and a footman was pulling off his warm overboot. "Oh, she is better." "And you?" he said, shaking himself. She took his hand in both of hers and drew it to her waist, never taking her eyes off him. "Well, I'm glad," she said, coldly scanning her. "Oh, well, I'm glad," he said, coldly scanning her hair, her dress, which he knew she had put on for him. All was charming, but how many times it had charmed him. And the stern, stony expression that she so dreaded settled upon his face. "Well, I'm glad. And are you well?" he said, wiping his damp beard with his handkerchief and kissing her hand. Never mind, she thought. Only let him be here, and so long as he's here, he dare not cease to love me. The evening was spent happily in the presence of Princess Varvara, who complained to him that Anna had been taking morphine in his absence. "What am I to do?" "I couldn't sleep. My thoughts prevented me. When he's here, I never take it. Hardly ever." He told her about the election, and Anna knew how, by adroit questions, to bring him to what gave him most pleasure, his own success. She told him of everything that interested him at home, and all that she told him was the most cheerful description. But late in the evening, when they were alone, Anna, seeing that she had regained complete possession of him, wanted to erase the painful expression of the glance he had given her for her letter. She said, "Tell me frankly, you were vexed at getting my letter, and you didn't believe me." As soon as she had said it, she felt that however warm his feelings were to her, He had not forgiven her for that. Yes, he said. The letter was so strange. First, Annie ill, and then you thought of coming yourself. It was all the truth. Oh, I don't doubt that. Yes, you do doubt it. You are vexed, I see. Not for one moment. I'm only vexed, that's true, that you seem somehow unwilling to admit that there are duties, the duty of going to a concert. But we won't talk of it, he said. Why not talk about it? She said. I only mean to say that matters of real importance may turn up. Now, for instance, I shall have to go to Moscow to arrange about the house. Anna, why are you so irritable? Don't you know that I can't live without you? If so, said Anna, her voice changing drastically, it means that you are sick of this life. Yes, you will come for a day and go away as men do. Anna, that's cruel. I am ready to give up my whole life. But she did not hear him. If you go to Moscow, I will go too. I will not stay here. Either we must separate or else live together. Why? You know, that's my one desire. But for that, we must get a divorce. I will write to him. I see I cannot go on like this, but I will come with you to Moscow. You talk as if you were threatening me, but I desire nothing so much as never to be parted from you, said Vronsky, smiling. But as he said these words, there gleamed in his eyes not merely a cold look, but the vindictive look of a man persecuted and made cruel. She saw the look and correctly divined its meaning. If so, it's a calamity, that glance told her. It was a moment's impression, but she never forgot it. Anna wrote to her husband asking him about a divorce, and towards the end of November, taking leave of Princess Varvara, who wanted to go to Petersburg, she went with Vronsky to Moscow. Expecting every day an answer from Alexei Alexandrovich, and after that, the divorce, they now established themselves together, like married people. End of the chapter, and end of part 6. We've made it. We've made it through part 6. There may have been doubts, but we've done it. All right, so this end of the chapter, we are with Anna, and with Anna being by herself, we are with her thoughts and with her doubts and her just being self-conscious and everything like that. And so when Vronsky had not returned or sent a letter of him being later than he expected, she starts to panic and thinks that maybe he's not where he said he was going to be, or, you know, something has happened to keep him away. So to bring him back, she says that Annie is sick, saying that she is sicker than she actually is, and also that Anna, would happily go to him and, bring him back. And as she's, writing this letter, she's also remembering the look that Vronsky had when he was leaving, which was very cold, and she's marking that as the beginning of indifference. And so now, she thought that she had to fight for him before, but now she really feels like she needs to fight for him. And so even though Vronsky, with his words and with his actions, are very much saying, you are the person for me, I am going to stay with you, she is just holding tighter and tighter and tighter, fearful that if she even lets go just a little bit, it's gonna be chaotic and she's going to lose him. So Anna is like, if you leave, I need to leave with you. I can't live with us parted. This isn't gonna work. And Vronsky is like, cool, that means that you have to get a divorce. And she's like, all right, I'll do it. And so she writes finally to her husband, Alexei. They're both named Alexei, I know. But to Alexei Alexandrovich, her husband, whom she's still married to ask for a divorce. And so they now both have this assumption that they are going to get the response okaying the divorce because Alexei previously said that he would, and so now they are officially living as a married couple. All right. Are we ready for part 7? Ugh. I feel like part 6, even though it's the same size as all of the other parts, it just. Part 7, Chapter 1. The Levins had been 3 months in Moscow. The date had long passed on which, according to the most trustworthy calculations of people learned in such matters, Kitty should have been confined. But she was still about, and there was nothing to show that her time was any nearer than 2 months ago. The doctor, the monthly nurse, and Dolly and her mother, and most of all Levin, could not think of the approaching event without terror, began to be impatient and uneasy. Kitty was the only person who felt perfectly calm and happy. She was distinctly conscious now of the birth of a new feeling of love for the future child, for her to some extent actually existing already, and she brooded blissfully over this feeling. He was not by now altogether a part of herself, but sometimes lived his own life independently of her. Often this separate being gave her pain, but at the same time she wanted to laugh with a strange new joy. All the people she loved were with her, and all were so good to her, so attentively caring for her, so entirely pleasant was everything presented to her, that if she had not known and felt that it must all soon be over, she could not have wished for a better and pleasanter life. The only thing that spoiled the charm of this manner of life was that her husband was not here as she loved him to be, and as he was in the country. She liked his serene, friendly, and hospitable manner in the country. In the town he seemed continually uneasy and on his guard, as though he were afraid someone would be rude to him, and still more to her. At home in the country, knowing himself distinctly to be in his right place, he was never in haste to be off elsewhere. He was never unoccupied. Here in town, he was in continual hurry, as though afraid of missing something. And yet, he had nothing to do, and she felt sorry for him. To others, she knew, he did not appear an object of pity. On the contrary, when Kitty looked at him in society, as one sometimes looks at those ones one loves, trying to see him as if he were a stranger, so as to catch the impression he must make on others, she saw with a panic, even of jealous fear, that he was far indeed from being a pitiable figure, that he was very attractive with his fine breeding, his rather old-fashioned, reserved courtesy with women, his powerful figure and striking, as she thought, and expressive face. But she saw him not from without, but from within. She saw that here he was not himself. That was the only way she could define his condition to herself. Sometimes she inwardly reproached him for his inability to live in the town. Sometimes she recognized that it was really hard for him to order his life here so that he could be satisfied with it. What had he to do, indeed? He did not care for cards. He did not go to a club. Spending the time with jovial gentlemen of Oblonsky's type, she knew now what that meant. It meant drinking, and going somewhere after drinking. She could not think without horror of where men went on such occasions. Was he to go into society? But she knew he could only find satisfaction in that if he took pleasure in the society of young women, and that she could not wish for. Should he stay at home with her mother and her sisters? But much as she liked and enjoyed their conversations forever on the same subjects, as the old prince called the sisters' talk, she knew it must bore him. What was there left for him to do? To go on writing at his books he had indeed attempted, and at first he used to go to the library and make extracts and look up references for his book, but, as he told her, the more he did nothing, the less time he had to do anything. And besides, he complained that he had talked too much about his book here, and that consequently all his ideas about it were muddled and had lost their interest for him. One advantage in this town life was that quarrels hardly ever happened between them here in town, whether it was that their conditions were different or that they had both become more careful and sensible in that respect. They had no quarrels in Moscow for jealousy, which they had so dreaded when they moved from the country. One event, an event of great importance to both from that point of view, did indeed happen. That was Kitty's meeting with Vronsky. The old Princess Maria Borisovna, Kitty's grandmother, who had always been so very fond of her, had insisted on seeing her. Kitty, though she did not go into society at all on account of her condition, went with her father to see the venerable old lady, and there met Vronsky. The only thing Kitty could reproach herself for at this meeting was that at the instant when she recognized in his civilian dress the features once so familiar to her, her breath failed her. The blood rushed to her heart, and a vivid blush, she felt it, overspread her face. But this lasted only a few seconds. Before her father, who purposely began talking in a loud voice to Vronsky, had finished, she was perfectly ready to look at Vronsky, to speak to him, if necessary, exactly as she spoke to Princess Maria Borisovna, and more than that, to do so in such a way that everything to the faintest intonation and smile would have been approved by her husband, whose unseen presence she seemed to feel about her at that instant. She said in a few words to him, even smiled serenely at his joke about the elections, which he called our parliament. She had to smile to show she saw the joke, but she turned away immediately to Princess Maria Borisovna and did not once glance at him till he got up to go. Then she looked at him, but evidently only because it would be uncivil not to look at a man when he is saying goodbye. She was grateful to her father for saying nothing to her about their meeting Vronsky, but she saw by his special warmth to her after the visit during their usual walk that he was pleased with her. She was pleased with herself. She had not expected she would have the power, while keeping somewhere in the bottom of her heart all the memories of her old feeling for Vronsky, not only to seem, but to be perfectly indifferent and composed with him. Levin flushed a great deal more than she when she told him she had met Vronsky at Princess Maria Borisovna's. It was very hard for her to tell him this, but still harder to go on speaking of the details of the meeting as he did not question her, but simply gazed at her with a frown. "I am not very sorry you weren't there," she said. "Not that you weren't in the room. I couldn't have been so natural in your presence. I am blushing now much more, much more," she said, blushing till the tears came into her eyes, "but that you couldn't see through a crack." The truthful eyes told Levin that she was satisfied with herself, and in spite of her blushing, he was quickly reassured and began questioning her, which was all she wanted. When he had heard everything, even to the detail that for the first second she could not help flushing, but that afterwards she was just as direct and as much at her ease as with any chance acquaintance, Levin was quite happy again, and said he was glad of it, and would not now behave as stupidly as he had done at the election, but would try for the first time he met Vronsky to be as friendly as possible. "It's so wretched to feel that there's a man almost an enemy whom it's painful to meet," said Levin. "I'm very, very glad." End of the chapter. Short and sweet. We're back with Levin and Kitty. Okay, it has been a couple months now. They have moved from the country to Moscow because Kitty is expecting a baby, and so they feel that it is just better for her to be in the city so that they more access to better doctors. And so their biggest worry was jealousy. So while Kitty is visiting her godmother, she's visiting someone, but Vronsky is there, and it is unexpected. She's going there with her papa. It's unexpected, and she's actually surprised that she feels indifferent to him. Previously, Vronsky had proposed to her, which is why it felt so like it would be something that is bad and like a weird meeting, but it turned out not to be, which is great. Something both that Kitty sort of wasn't looking forward to, but also Levin wasn't looking forward to, because Levin is like sloppy seconds. Kind of. Sort of. But it was fine. She was there. She, chuckled at his jokes, but wasn't like super engaged with him, just enough to be polite. And so she recalls the experience to Levin. Levin at first is like on edge, because this is the first time that they've met Vronsky since Vronsky never proposed. Kitty was expecting a proposal. My mistake. I misspoke. But since the expected proposal that never came, it's the first time that they're meeting. And so Levin is just like on edge, and Kitty is like, you don't have to worry. This is what happened. And so now they're fine. Part 7, Chapter 2. Go, please. Go then and call on the bulls, Kitty said to her husband when he came in to see her at 11 o'clock before going out. I know you are dining at the club. Papa put down your name. But what are you going to do in the morning? I am only going to Karavasov, answered Levin. Why so early? He promised to introduce me to Metrov. I wanted to talk to him about my work. He's a distinguished scientific man from Petersburg, said Levin. Yes, wasn't it his article you were praising so? Well, and after that, said Kitty. I shall go to the court, perhaps, about my sister's business. And the concert? She queried. I shan't go there all alone. No? Do go. There are going to be some new things that interested you, so I should certainly go. Well, anyway, I shall come home before dinner, he said, looking at his watch. Put on your frock coat so that you can go straight to call on Countess Bola. But is it absolutely necessary? Oh, absolutely. He has been to see us. Come, what is it? You go in, sit down, talk for 5 minutes of the weather, get up, and go. Oh, you wouldn't believe it. I've got so out of the way of all this that it makes me feel positively ashamed. It's such a horrible thing to do. A complete outsider walks in, sits down, stays on with nothing to do, wastes their time and worries himself, and walks away. Kitty laughed. Why, I suppose you used to pay calls before you were married, didn't you? Yes, I did, but I always felt ashamed, and now I'm so out of the way of it that, by Jove, I'd sooner go 2 days running without my dinner than pay this call. One's so ashamed. I feel all the while that they're annoyed, that they're saying, what has he come for? No, they don't. I'll answer for that, said Kitty, looking into his face with a laugh. She took his hand. Well, goodbye. Do go, please. He was just going out after kissing his wife's hand when she stopped him. Kostya, do you know I've only 50 rubles left? Oh, all right. I'll go to the bank and get some. How much? He said with the expression of dissatisfaction she knew so well. No, wait a minute. She held his hand. Let's talk about it. It worries me. I seem to spend nothing unnecessary, but money seems to fly away simply. We don't manage well, somehow. It's all right, he said with a little cough, looking at her from under his brows. That cough she knew well. It was a sign of intense dissatisfaction, not with her, but with himself. He certainly was displeased, not at so much money being spent, but at being reminded of what he, knowing something was unsatisfactory, wanted to forget. I have told Sokolov to sell the wheat and to borrow in advance on the mill. We shall have money enough in any case. Yes, but I'm afraid that altogether... Oh, it's all right, he repeated. Well, goodbye, darling. No, I'm really sorry sometimes that I listened to Mama. How nice it would have been in the country. As it is, I'm worrying you all, and we're wasting our money. Not at all. Not once since I've been married have I said that things could have been better than they truly are. Truly? She said, looking into his eyes. He had said it without thinking, simply to console her. But when he glanced at her and saw those sweet, truthful eyes fashioned questioningly on him, he repeated it with his whole heart. I was positively forgetting her, he thought, and he remembered what was before them, so soon to come. Will it be soon? How do you feel? He whispered, taking her two hands. I have so often thought so, that now I don't think about it or know anything about it. And you're not frightened? She smiled contemptuously. Not in the least little bit, she said. Well, if anything happens, I shall be at Katavasov's. No, nothing will happen, and don't think about it. I'm going for a walk on the boulevard with Papa. We're going to see Dolly. I shall expect you before dinner. Oh, do you know that Dolly's position is becoming utterly impossible? She's in debt all round. She hasn't a penny. We were talking yesterday with Mama and Arseny. This was her sister's husband, Lvov. And we determined to send you with him to talk to Stiva. It's really unbearable. One can't speak to Papa about it. But if you and he... Why, what can we do? Said Levin. You'll be at Arseny's anyway. Talk to him. He will tell what we decided. I agree to everything Arseny thinks beforehand. I'll go and see him. By the way, if I do go to the concert, I'll go with Natalia. Well, goodbye. On the steps, Levin was stopped by his old servant Kuzma, who had been with him before his marriage, and now looked after their household in town. Beauty. That was the left shaft horse, brought up from the country. Has been badly shod and is quite lame, he said. What does your honor wish to be done? During the first part of their stay in Moscow, Levin had used his own horses brought up from the country. He had tried to arrange this part of their expenses in the best and cheapest way possible. But it appeared that their own horses came dearer than hired horses, and they still hired too. Send for the veterinary. There may be a bruise. And for Katerina Alexandrovna, said Kuzma. Levin was not by now struck, as he had been at first, by the fact that to get from one end of Moscow to the other he had to have two powerful horses put into a heavy carriage, to take the carriages 3 miles through the snowy slush, and to keep it standing there 4 hours, paying 5 roubles every time. Now, it seemed quite natural. Hire a pair of our carriage from the jobmaster, said he. Yes, sir. And so, simply and easily, thanks to the facilities of town life, Levin settled a question which, in the country, would have called for so much personal trouble and exertion, and going out onto the steps, he called a sledge, sat down, and drove Nikitsky. On the way, he thought no more of money, but mused on the introduction that awaited him to the Petersburg savant, a writer on sociology, and what he would say to him about his book. Only during the first days of his stay in Moscow, Levin had been struck by the expenditure, strange to one living in the country, unproductive but inevitable, that was expected of him on every side. But by now he had grown used to it. That had happened to him in this matter which is said to happen to drunkards. The first glass sticks in the throat, The second flies down like a hawk, but after the third, they're like tiny little birds. When Levin had changed his first 100-ruble note to pay for liveries for his footman and hall porter, he could not help reflecting that these liveries were of no use to anyone, but they were undoubtedly necessary, to judge by the amazement of the princess and Kitty when he suggested that they might do without liveries, that these liveries would cost the wages of 2 laborers for the summer, that is, would pay for about 300 working days from Easter to Ash Wednesday, and each a day of hard work from early morning to late evening. And that 100-ruble note did stick in his throat. But the next note, changed to pay for providing a dinner for their relations that cost 28 rubles, though it did excite in Levin the reflection that 28 rubles meant 9 measures of oats, which men would, with groans and sweat, have reaped and bound and thrashed and winnowed and sifted and sown. This next one he parted with more easily. And now the notes he changed no longer aroused such reflections, and they flew off like little birds. Whether the labor devoted to obtaining the money corresponded to the pleasure given by what was bought with it, with a consideration he had long ago dismissed. His business calculation that there was a certain price below which he could not sell certain grain was forgotten, too. The rye, for the price of which he had so long held out, had been sold for 50 kopecks a measure cheaper than it had been fetching a month ago. Even the consideration that with such an expenditure he could not go on living for a year without debt, that even had no force. Only one thing was essential: to have money in the bank, without inquiring where it came from, so as to know that one had the wherewithal to buy meat for tomorrow, and this condition had hitherto been fulfilled. He had always had the money in the bank. But now, the money in the bank had gone, and he could not quite tell where to get the next installment. And this it was which, at the moment when Kitty had mentioned money, had disturbed him. But he had no time to think about it. He drove off, thinking of Katavasov and the meeting of Metrov that was before him. End of the chapter. We have more life with Kitty and Levin. And interesting, so they usually live in the country, and Levin, is a landowner. He has a bunch of laborers, he has a bunch of land, and, has crops and things like that. And so that is where his money is coming from. And usually he is, living pretty. He's fine. He's never had any want for anything. He has just been fine. And now that they're in the city, it's more expensive there. And I love the analogy that he said, that it is, the first note that you spend is the hardest, and it kind of gets stuck in your throat. And then the second one that you spend is like, it goes down a little bit easier. And then anything beyond that, the third and beyond, are just like little birds that they just fly through, and you don't even really pay attention. And I think that is so interesting, and is actually is it psychological, sociological? It's one of those things that really does happen with spending money. Like, once you've already spent like a certain threshold, which is different for each person, then it just makes it easier for that person to just keep spending money. And I just think that is fascinating. But anyway, so talking about money, and so Levin is about to go out to the town to have this meeting with a couple people, and Kitty is staying home, still very much pregnant, and is like, oh no, you need to go. Like, there's nothing that you can really do here. I am surrounded by people that I love who are definitely taking care of me. Go. But also money. And so it is something that Levin had been constantly thinking about, and now that Kitty is bringing it up as well, it is putting like this greater strain. And it's just the two of them right now. They have no children, and they're about to have a child. Is it going to be more strenuous? I mean, yes, because there's a third mouth to feed. But I'm assuming that they're going to go back to the country. I'm assuming. But who knows? Who knows? Also, it's interesting seeing Levin get used to, like, acclimate to the city life. He has just become both the country mouse and the city mouse. all in one package. And I think that's, like, what has happened. Part 7, Chapter 3. Levin had, on this visit to town, seen a great deal of his old friend at the university, Professor Katavasov, whom he had not seen since his marriage. He liked in Katavasov the clearness and simplicity of his conception of life. Levin thought that the clearness of Katavasov's conception of life was due to the poverty of his nature. Katavasov thought that the disconnectedness of Levin's ideas was due to his lack of intellectual discipline. But Levin enjoyed Katavasov's clearness, and Katavasov enjoyed the abundance of Levin's untrained ideas, and they liked to meet and to discuss. Levin had read Katavasov some parts of his book, and he had liked them. On the previous day, Katavasov had met Levin at a public lecture and told him that the celebrated Metrov, whose article Levin had so much liked, was in Moscow, that he had been much interested by what Katavasov had told him about Levin's work, and that he was coming to see him tomorrow at 11, and would be very glad to make Levin's acquaintance. "You're positively a reformed character, I'm glad to see," said Katavasov, meeting Levin in the little drawing room. "I heard the bell and thought, impossible that it can be he at the exact time. Well, what do you say to the Montenegrins now? A race of warriors." "Why, what happened?" asked Levin. Katavasov, in a few words, told him the last piece of news from the war, and going into his study, introduced Levin to a short, thick-set man of pleasant appearance. This was Metrov. The conversation touched for a brief space on politics and on how recent events were looked at in the higher spheres in Petersburg. Metrov repeated a saying that had reached him through a most trustworthy source, reported as having been uttered on the subject by the Tsar and one of the ministers. Katavasov had heard also on excellent authority that the Tsar had said something quite different. Levin tried to imagine circumstances in which both sayings might have been uttered, and the conversation on that topic dropped. "Yes, here he's written almost a book on the natural conditions of the laborer in relation to the land," said Katavasov. "I'm not a specialist, but I, as a natural science man, was pleased at his not taking mankind as something outside biological laws, but, on the contrary, seeing his dependence on his surroundings, and in that dependence seeking the laws of his development." "It's very interesting," said Metrov. "What I began precisely was to write a book on agriculture, but studying the chief instrument of agriculture, the laborer," said Levin, reddening. "I could not help coming to quite unexpected results." And Levin began carefully, as it were, feeling his ground, to expound his views. He knew Metrov had written an article against the generally accepted theory of political economy, but to what extent he could reckon on his sympathy with his own new views he did not know, and could not guess from the clear and serene face of the learned man. "But in what do you see the special characteristics of the Russian laborer?" said Metrov. "In his biological characteristics, so to speak, or in the condition in which he is placed?" Levin saw that there was an idea underlying this question with which he did not agree. But he went on explaining his own idea that the Russian laborer was a quite special view of the land, different from that of other people, and to support this proposition, he made haste to add that in his opinion this attitude of the Russian peasant was due to the consciousness of his vocation to people vast, unoccupied expanses in the East. One may easily be led into error in basing any conclusion on the general vocation of a people, said Metrov, interrupting Levin. The condition of the laborer will always depend on his relation to the land and to capital. And without letting Levin finish explaining his idea, Metrov began expounding to him the special point of his own theory. In what the point of his theory lay, Levin did not understand, because he did not take the trouble to understand. He saw that Metrov, like other people, in spite of his own article in which he had attacked the current theory of political economy, looked at the position of the Russian peasant simply from the point of view of capital, wages, and rent. He would indeed have been obliged to admit that in the eastern, much the larger, part of Russia, rent was as yet nil, that for 9/10 of the 80 millions of the Russian peasants, wages took the form simply of food provided for themselves, and that capital does not yet so far exist except in the form of the most primitive tools. Yet it was only from that point of view that he considered every laborer, though in many points he differed from the economists and had his own theory of the wage fund, which he expounded to Levin. Levin listened reluctantly, and at first made objections. He would have liked to interrupt Metrov, to explain his own thought, which is, his opinion, would have rendered further exposition of Metrov's theories superfluous. But later on, feeling convinced that they looked at the matter so differently, that they could never understand one another, he did not even oppose his statements, but simply listened. Although what Metrov was saying was by now utterly devoid of interest for him, he yet experienced a certain satisfaction in listening to him. It flattered his vanity that such a learned man should explain his ideas to him so eagerly, with such intensity and confidence in Levin's understanding of the subject, sometimes with a mere hint referring him to a whole aspect of the subject. He put this down to his own credit, unaware that Metrov, who had already discussed his theory over and over again with all his intimate friends, talked of it with special eagerness to every new person, and in general was eager to talk to anyone of any subject that interested him, even if still obscure to himself. "We are late, though," said Katavasov, looking at his watch directly. Metrov had finished his discourse. "Yes, there's a meeting of the Society of Amateurs today in commemoration of the Jubilee of Zvintich," said Katavasov in answer to Levin's inquiry. "Petrov Ivanovich and I were going. I've promised to deliver an address on his labors in zoology. Come along with us. It's very interesting." "Yes, and indeed it's time to start," said Metrov. "Come with us, and from there, if you care to, come to my place. I should very much like to hear your work." "Oh, no, it's no good yet. It's unfinished. But I shall be very glad to go to the meeting." "I say, friends, have you heard? He has handed in the separate report," Katavasov called from the other room where he was putting on his frock coat. And a conversation sprang up upon the university question, which was a very important event that winter in Moscow. 3 old professors in the council had not accepted the opinion of the younger professors. The young ones had registered a separate resolution. This, in the judgment of some peoples, was monstrous. In the judgment of others, it was the simplest and most just thing to do, and the professors were split up into 2 parties. One party, to which Katavasov belonged, saw in the opposite party a scoundrelly betrayal and treachery, while the opposite party saw in them childishness and lack of respect for the authorities. Levin, though he did not belong to the university, had several times already during his stay in Moscow heard and talked about this matter, and had his own opinion on the subject. He took part in the conversation that was continued in the street as they all three walked to the buildings of the old university. The meeting had already begun. Round the cloth-covered table at which Katavasov and Metrov seated themselves, there were some half-dozen persons, and one of these was bending close over a manuscript, reading something aloud. Levin sat down in one of the empty chairs that was standing round the table and, in a whisper, asked a student sitting near what was being read. The student said, eyeing Levin with displeasure, "Biography." Though Levin was not interested in the biography, he could not help listening and learned some new and interesting facts about the life of the distinguished man of science. When the reader had finished, the chairman thanked him and read some verses of the poet Ment saw him on the Jubilee and said a few words by way of thanks to the poet. Then Katavasov, in his loud, ringing voice, read his address on the scientific labors of the man whose Jubilee was being kept. When Katavasov had finished, Levin looked at his watch, saw it was past 1, and thought that there would not be time before the concert to read Metrov his book, and indeed, he did not now care to do so. During the reading, he had thought over their conversation. He saw distinctly now that though Metrov's ideas might perhaps have value, his own ideas had a value too, and their ideas could only be made clear and lead to something if each worked separately in his chosen path, and that nothing would be gained by putting their ideas together. And having made up his mind to refuse Metrov's invitation, Levin went up to him at the end of the meeting. Metrov introduced Levin to the chairman, with whom he was talking of the political news. Metrov told the chairman what he had already told Levin, and Levin made the same remarks on his news that he had already made that morning. But for the sake of variety, he expressed also a new opinion, which had only just struck him. After that, the conversation turned again on the university question. As Levin had already heard it all, he made haste to tell Metrov that he was sorry he could not take advantage of his invitation, took leave, and drove to Lvov's. End of the chapter. Okay. Levin. I just think it's so interesting that anytime Levin is challenged or has posed different ideas about agriculture or almost anything, Levin pauses for the briefest of moments and then is like, no, I will not be taking your ideas into account, and actually we will be better as humans and philosophers and fill in the blank if we just go our separate ways, instead of being like, oh, well, that's an interesting thought. I'm wondering if that in any way could enhance what I'm doing, instead of just completely writing it off. And I feel like Levin is the absolute king of being like, no. But we are with Levin, and he is meeting with Katavasov and with Metrov. Yeah, Metrov. And they are having a discussion, and Levin is just really wanting to talk about his book because of course he is, and his book is about how he is going to be revolutionizing how people work the land, basically. And then towards the end of the night, he's like, no, and actually I don't want to hang out with Metrov anymore. That's not my jam. No, thank you. Interesting. And so Levin goes off to like hang out with like one of his friends, family member. I don't know. Everybody's related somehow in this book, it seems. All right. Chapter 4, part 7, chapter 4. Lov, the husband of Natalia, Kitty's sister, had spent all his life in foreign capitals, where he had been educated and had been in the diplomatic service. During the previous year, he had left the diplomatic service, not owing to any unpleasantness. He never had any unpleasantness with anyone, and was transferred to the department of the court of the palace in Moscow in order to give his two boys the best education possible. In spite of the striking contrast in their habits and views and the fact that Lov was older than Levin, they had seen a great deal of one another that winter and had taken a great liking to each other. Lov was at home, and Levin went in to him unannounced. Lov, in a housecoat with a belt and in chemise, leather shoes, was sitting in an armchair, and with a pince-nez with blue glasses, he was reading a book that stood on a reading desk, while in his beautiful hand he held a half-burned cigarette daintily away from him. His handsome, delicate, and still youthful-looking face, to which his curly, glistening silver hair gave a still more aristocratic air, lightened up with a smile when he saw Levin. "Capital. I was meaning to send to you. How's Kitty? Sit here, it's more comfortable." He got up and pushed up a rocking chair. "Have you read the last circular in the Journal de St. Petersburg? I think it's excellent," he said with a slight French accent. Levin told him what he had heard from Katavasov was being said in Petersburg, and after talking a little about politics, he told him of his interview with Metrov and the Learned Society's meeting. To Lov, it was very interesting. "It's what I envy you, that you are able to mix in these interesting scientific circles," he said. And as he talked, he passed, as usual, into French, which was easier to him. "It's true, I haven't the time for it. My official work and the children leave me no time, and then I'm not ashamed to own that my education has been too defective." "That I don't believe," said Levin, with a smile, feeling, as he always did, touched at Lov's low opinion of himself, which was not in the least put on from a desire to seem or to be modest, but was absolutely sincere. "Oh, yes, indeed. I feel now how badly educated I am. To educate my children, I positively have to look up a great deal, and in fact, simply to study myself, for it's not enough to have teachers, there must be someone to look after them, just as on your land you want laborers and an overseer. See what I'm reading?" He pointed to grammar on the desk. "It's expected of Misha, and it's so difficult. Come, explain to me. Here he says..." Levin tried to explain to him that it couldn't be understood, but that it had to be taught. But Lov would not agree with him. "Oh, you're laughing at it. On the contrary, you can't imagine how, when I look at you, I'm always learning the task that lies before me, and that is the education of one's children." "Well, there's nothing for you to learn," said Lov. "All I know," said Levin, "is that I have never seen better brought-up children than yours, and I wouldn't wish for children better than yours." Lov visibly tried to restrain the expression of his delight, but he was positively radiant with smiles. "If only they're better than I, that's all I desire. You don't know yet all the work," he said, "with boys who've been left like mine to run wild abroad. You'll catch all that up. They're such clever children. The great thing is the education of character. That's what I learn when I look at your children." "You talk of the education of character. You can't imagine how difficult that is. You've hardly succeeded in combating one's tendency when another's crop up, and the struggle begins again. If one had not a support in religion, you remember we talked about that, no father could bring children up relying on his own strength alone, without that help." This subject, which always interested Levin, was cut short by the entrance of the beauty Natalia Alexandrovna, dressed to go out. "Oh, I didn't know you were here," she said, unmistakably feeling no regret, but a positive pleasure in interrupting this conversation on a topic she had heard so much of that she was by now weary of it. "Well, how is Kitty? I am dining with you today. I tell you what, Arseny," she turned to her husband, "you take the carriage." And the husband and wife began to discuss their arrangements for the day. as the husband had to drive to meet someone on official business, while the wife had to go to the concert and some public meeting of a committee on the Eastern question. There was a great deal to consider and settle. Levin had to take part in their plans as one of themselves. It was settled that Levin should go with Natalia to the concert and the meeting, and that from there they should send the carriage to the office for Arseny, and he should call for her and take her to Kitty's, or that, if he had not finished his work, he should send the carriage back, and Levin would go with her. "He's spoiling me," Love said to his wife. "He assures me that our children are splendid, when I know how much that's bad there is in them." "Arseny goes to extremes, I always say," said his wife. "If you look for perfections, you will never be satisfied. And it's true, as Papa says, that when we were brought up there was one extreme. We were kept in a basement, while our parents lived in the best rooms. Now it's just the other way. The parents are in the wash-house, while the children are in the best rooms. Parents now are not expected to live at all, but to exist altogether for their children." "Well, what if they like it better?" Love said with a beautiful smile, touched her hands. "Anyone who didn't know you would think you were a stepmother, not a true mother." "No, extremes are not good in anything," Natalia said serenely, putting his paper knife straight in its proper place on the table. "Well, come here, you perfect children," Love said to the two handsome boys who came in, and after bowing to Levin, went up to their father, obviously wishing to ask him about something. Levin would have liked to talk to them, to hear what they would say to their father. But Natalia began talking to him, and then Love's colleague in the service, Mahotin, walked in, wearing his court uniform, to go with him to meet someone, and a conversation was kept up without a break upon Herzegovina, Princess Korzinskaya, the town council, and the sudden death of Madame Apraxina. Levin even forgot the commission entrusted to him. He recollected it as he was going into the hall. "Oh, Kitty told me to talk to you about Oblonsky," he said as Love was standing on the stairs, seeing his wife and Levin off. Yes, Maman wants us to attack him," he said, blushing. "But why should I?" "Well, then I will attack him," said Madame Lovna, with a smile, standing in her white sheepskin cape, waiting till they had finished speaking. "Come, let us go." End of chapter 4. Okay, chapter 4, Levin is hanging out with his buddy, who is married to Natalia, who is Kitty's sister. Great. And so they're chatting. They are going to, be social together. And in the interim, while they're just waiting and pleasantries and stuff, we get upon the subject of education and children, which we know Levin's feels about children generally, how they're raised, as well as whether or not and how they should be educated. He doesn't believe in hoity-toity education, why should you learn Latin? It's a dying language, those types of things. Why are you forcing your child to speak French to you at home when they're not going to be speaking French, in their immediate life, those types of things. And also he has had a lot of opinions about the children in his life and surrounding him, and how he's just would never have children like this. Children are wild and crazy, which some of them are, very fair. But now he's seeing a good example where the children of Natalia and Love are highly educated, but also have really good character. And that is the most important part. And Love is talking about how difficult it is to have that character built up, because once you establish a good character in one of your kids, then another one is born and you have to start all over again. And it's just constant. And now they're on their way out. Chapter 5. At the concert in the afternoon, two very interesting things were performed. One was a fantasia, King Lear. The other was a quartet, dedicated to the memory of Bach. Both were new and in the new style, and Levin was eager to form an opinion of them. After escorting his sister-in-law to her stall, he stood against a column and tried to listen as attentively and conscientiously as possible. He tried not to let his attention be distracted, and not to spoil his impression by looking at the conductor in a white tie, waving his arms, which always disturbed his enjoyment of music so much, or the ladies in bonnets, with strings carefully tied over their ears, and all these people either thinking of nothing at all, or thinking of all sorts of things except the music. He tried to avoid meeting musical connoisseurs or talkative acquaintances, and stood looking at the floor straight before him, listening. But the more he listened to the fantasia of King Lear, the further he felt from forming any definite opinion of it. There was, as it were, a continual beginning, a preparation of the musical expression of some feeling, but it fell to pieces again directly, breaking into new musical motives, or simply nothing but the whims of the composer, exceedingly complex but disconnected sounds. And these fragmentary musical expressions, though sometimes beautiful, were disagreeable, because they were utterly unexpected and not led up to by anything. Gaiety and grief and despair and tenderness and triumph followed one another without any connection, like the emotion of a madman. And those emotions, like a madman's, sprang up quite unexpectedly. During the whole of the performance, Levin felt like a deaf man watching people dancing, and was in a state of complete bewilderment when the fantasia was over, and felt a great weariness from the fruitless strain of his attention. Loud applause resounded on all sides. Everyone got up, moved about, and began talking. Anxious to throw some light on his own perplexity from the impressions of others, Levin began to walk about, looking for connoisseurs, and was glad to see a well-known musical amateur in conversation with Pestsov, whom he knew. "Marvelous," Pestsov was saying in his mellow bass. "How are you, Konstantin Dmitrievich? Particularly sculpturesque and plastic, so to say, and richly colored in that passage where you feel Cordelia's approach, where woman, das ewig Weiblich, enters into conflict with fate, isn't it?" "You mean, what has Cordelia to do with it?" Levin asked timidly, forgetting that the fantasia was supposed to represent King Lear. "Cordelia comes in. See here," said Pestsov, tapping his finger on the satiny surface of the program he held in his hand, and passing it to Levin. Only then Levin recollected the title of the fantasia, and made haste to read in the Russian translation the lines from Shakespeare that were printed on the back of the program. "You can't follow it without that," said Pestsov, addressing Levin, as the person he had been speaking to had gone away, and he had no one to talk to. In the entr'acte, Levin and Pestsov fell into an argument upon the merits and defects of music of the Wagner school. Levin maintained that the mistake of Wagner and all his followers lay in their trying to take music into the sphere of another art, just as poetry goes wrong when it tries to paint a face as the art of painting ought to do. And as an instance of this mistake, he cited the sculptor who carved in marble certain poetic phantasms flitting round the figure of the poet on the pedestal. "These phantoms were so far from being phantoms that they were positively clinging to the ladder," said Levin. The comparison pleased him, but he could not remember whether he had not used the same phrase before, and to Pestsov, too, and as he said it, he felt confused. Pestsov maintained that art is one, and that it can attain its highest manifestations only by conjunction with all kinds of art. The second piece that was performed, Levin could not hear. Pestsov, who was standing beside him, was talking to him almost all the time, condemning the music for its excessive affective assumption of simplicity, and comparing it with the simplicity of the pre-Raphaelites in painting. As he went out, Levin met many more acquaintances, with whom he talked of politics, of music, and of common acquaintances. Among others, he met Count Bol, whom he had utterly forgotten to call upon. "Well, go at once, then," Madame Lovna said, when he told her. "Perhaps they'll not be at home, and then you can come to the meeting to fetch me. You'll find me still here." End of the chapter. Okay, this chapter I think is actually kind of funny. I appreciate seeing Levin out of his depth because there are so many subjects that he just is like a tree trunk. He is just so solid about. So when he is seeing a concert about King Lear and he's trying to concentrate so aggressively to understand the music, and he's just getting lost. The more he concentrates, the more lost and confused he feels about the music. And while at the venue, he's trying to avoid conversation with very specific types of people. One of them being musicians and people who know a lot about, about King Lear, but then also about the music itself and about the complexity of music or the simplicity of music. And who should he run into but somebody who is discussing just that. The complexity and the simplicity and ranting about it, so much so that Levin doesn't even get to hear the second performance, because this guy is just constantly talking at him about the music that Levin can't hear. And I find that to be comical. I find that to be comical. Just to imagine and to just watch that happening is a joy. And now he has seen somebody that he does know and that he does want to talk to, so he's going over that way. Chapter 6. These chapters are just flying by. "Perhaps they're not at home," said Levin, as he went into the hall of Countess Bola's house. "At home. Please walk in," said the porter, resolutely removing his overcoat. "How annoying," thought Levin, with a sigh, taking off one glove and stroking his hat. "What did I come for? What have I to say to them?" As he passed through the first drawing room, Levin met in the doorway Countess Bola, giving some order to a servant with a careworn and severe face. On seeing Levin, she smiled and asked him to come into the little drawing room, where he heard voices. In this room there were sitting in armchairs the two daughters of the Countess and a Moscow colonel whom Levin knew. Levin went up, greeted them, and sat down beside the sofa with his hat on his knees. "How is your wife? Have you been at the concert? We couldn't go. Mama had to be at the funeral service." "Yes, I heard. What a sudden death," said Levin. The Countess came in and sat down on the sofa, and she too asked after his wife and inquired about the concert. Levin answered and repeated an inquiry about Madame Apraxina's sudden death. "But she was always in weak health. Were you at the opera today?" "Yes, I was." "Luca was very good." "Yes, very good," he said, as it was utterly of no consequence to him what they thought of him. He began repeating what they had heard 100 times about the characteristics of the singer's talent. Countess Bola pretended to be listening. Then, when he had said enough and paused, the colonel, who had been silent till then, began to talk. The colonel, too, talked of the opera and about culture. At last, after seeing the proposed full journée at Turin's, the colonel laughed, got up noisily, and went away. Levin, too, rose, but he saw by the face of the countess that it was not yet time for him to go. He must stay 2 minutes longer. He sat down. But as he was thinking all the while how stupid it was, he could not find a subject for conversation, and sat silent. "You are not going to the public meeting? They say it will be very interesting," began the countess. "No, I promised my belle-sœur to fetch her from it," said Levin. A silence followed. The mother once more exchanged glances with the daughter. "Well, now I think the time has come," thought Levin, and he got up. The ladies shook hands with him and begged him to say "mille choses" to his wife for them. The porter asked him, as he gave him his coat, "Where is your honor staying?" and immediately wrote down his address in a big, handsomely bound book. "Of course, I don't care, but still I feel ashamed and awfully stupid," thought Levin, consoling himself with the reflection that everyone does it. He drove to the public meeting, where he was to find his sister-in-law, so as to drive home with her. At the public meeting of the committee, there were a great many people, and almost all the highest society. Levin was in time for the report, which, as everyone said, was very interesting. When the reading of the report was over, people moved about, and Levin met Zviashki, who invited him very pressingly to come that evening to a meeting of the Society of Agriculture, where a celebrated lecture was to be delivered, and Stepan Arkadyevitch, who had only just come from the races, and many other acquaintances, and Levin heard and uttered various criticisms on the meeting, on the new fantasia, and on a public trial. But, probably from the mental fatigue he was beginning to feel, he made a blunder in speaking on the trial, and this blunder he recalled several times with vexation, speaking of the sentence upon a foreigner who has been condemned in Russia, and of how unfair it would be to punish him by exile abroad. Levin repeated what he had heard the day before in conversation from an acquaintance. "I think sending him abroad is much the same as punishing a carp by putting it into the water," said Levin. Then he recollected that this idea, which he had heard from an acquaintance and uttered as his own, came from a fable of Krylov's, and that the acquaintance had picked it up from a newspaper article. After driving home with his sister-in-law and finding Kitty in good spirits and quite well, Levin drove to the club. End of chapter 6. Okay, chapter 6, Levin is with more society. Okay, the amount of meetings and changing locations that Levin is going through tonight, my little introverted self would have to spend a week to recover. At least. So, after the concert, he goes to go hang out with other people that he does know, and he goes to their house, and he is not really having intellectual conversations, just mostly agreeing with the countess, agreeing with the daughters, that sort of thing, and not really challenging anything, and also he's not super interested in this conversation. He doesn't really go into details about how he actually felt about the Fantasia and about the music, because he knows that they're not actually looking for that. So, good on you, Levin, for reading the room accurately. And now he left. But like going social situation to social situation to social situation, and I'm actually kind of impressed that at each one he was able to, read the room and be able to be like, yes, this is what is expected of me being Levin here in this situation and with this group of people, and I find that fascinating as well. We have time for one more. Shall we? All right. Chapter 7. Levin reached the club just at the right time. Members and visitors were driving up as he arrived. Levin had not been at the club for a very long while, not since he lived in Moscow, when he was leaving the university and going into society. He remembered the club, the external details of its arrangement, but he had completely forgotten the impression it had made on him in old days. But as soon as, driving into the wide semicircular court and getting out of the sledge, he mounted the stairs, and the hall porter, adorned with a crossway scarf, noiselessly opened the door to him with a bow, as soon as he saw in the porter's room the cloaks and galoshes of members who thought it less trouble to take them off downstairs, as soon as he heard the mysterious ringing bell that preceded him as he ascended the easy, carpeted staircase, and saw the statue of the landing, and the third porter at the top doors, a familiar figure grown older, in the club livery, opening the door without haste or delay, and scanning the visitors as they passed in. Levin felt the old impression of the club come back in a rush, an impression of repose, comfort, and propriety. "Your hat, please," the porter said to Levin, who forgot the club rule to leave his hat in the porter's room. "Long time since you've been. The prince put your name down yesterday. Prince Stepan Arkadyevitch is not here yet." The porter did not only know Levin, but also all his ties and relationships, and so immediately mentioned his intimate friends. Passing through the outer wall, divided up by screens and the room partitioned on the right, where a man sits at the fruit buffet, Levin overtook an old man walking slowly in, and entered the dining room full of noise and people. He walked along the tables, almost all full, and looked at the visitors. He saw people of all sorts, old and young, some he knew a little, some intimate friends. There was not a single cross or worried-looking face. All seemed to have left their cares and anxieties in the porter's room with their hats, and were all deliberately getting ready to enjoy the material blessings of life. Zviashki was here, and Sherbatskoy, Nevyudovsky, and the old prince, and Vronsky, and Sergei Ivanovich. "Ah, why are you late?" the prince said, smiling and giving him his hand over his own shoulder. "How's Kitty?" he added, smoothing out the napkin he had tucked in at his waistcoat button. "All right. They are dining at home, all three of them." "Ah, Aline Nadine, to be sure. There's no room for us. Go to that table and make haste and take a seat," said the prince, and turning away he carefully took a plate of eel soup. "Levin, this way!" a good-natured voice shouted a little farther on. It was Turovtsin. He was sitting with a young officer, and beside them were two chairs turned upside down. Levin gladly went up to them. He had always liked the good-hearted rake Turovtsin. He was associated in his mind with memories of his courtship, and at that moment, after the strain of intellectual conversation, the sight of Turovtsin's good-natured face was particularly welcome. "For you and Oblonsky. He'll be here directly." The young man, holding himself very erect, with eyes forever twinkling with enjoyment, was an officer from Petersburg, Gagin. Turovtsin introduced them. "Oblonsky's always late. Ah, here he is." "Have you only just come?" said Oblonsky, coming quickly towards them. "Good day. Had some vodka? Well, come along then." Levin got up and went with him to the big table spread with spirits and appetizers of the most various kinds. One would have thought that out of 24 delicacies one might find something to one's taste. But Stepan Arkadyevitch asked for something special, and one of the liveried waiters standing by immediately brought what was required. They drank a wine glassful and returned to their table. At once, while they were still at the soup, Gagin was served with champagne and told the waiter to fill 4 glasses. Levin did not refuse the wine and asked for a second bottle. He was very hungry and ate and drank with great enjoyment, and with still greater enjoyment took part in the lively and simple conversation of his companions. Gagin, dropping his voice, told the last good story from Petersburg, and the story, though improper and stupid, was so ludicrous that Levin broke into roars of laughter so loud that those near looked round. "That's in the same style as, 'That's a thing I can't endure.' You know the story?" said Stepan Arkadyevitch. "Ah, that's exquisite. Another bottle," he said to the waiter, and he began to relate his good story. "Pyotr Ilyich Vinovsky invites you to drink with him," a little old waiter interrupted Stepan Arkadyevitch, bringing 2 delicate glasses of sparkling champagne and addressing Stepan Arkadyevitch and Levin. Stepan Arkadyevitch took the glass, and looking towards a bald man with red mustaches at the other end of the table, he nodded to him, smiling. "Who's that?" asked Levin. "Oh, you met him once at my table, don't you remember? A good-natured fellow." Levin did the same as Stepan Arkadyevitch and took the glass. Stepan Arkadyevitch's anecdote, too, was very amusing. Levin told his story, and that, too, was successful. Then they talked of horses, of the races, of what they had been doing that day, and of how smartly Vronsky's atlas had won the first prize. Levin did not notice how the time passed at dinner. "Ah, here they are," Stepan Arkadyevitch said, stepping towards the end of dinner, leaning over the back of his chair and holding out his hand to Vronsky, who came up with a tall officer of the guards. Vronsky's face, too, beamed with the look of good-humored enjoyment that was general in the club. He propped his elbow playfully on Stepan Arkadyevitch's shoulder, whispering something to him, and he held out his hand to Levin with the same good-humored smile. "Very glad to meet you," he said. "I looked out for you at the election, but I was told you had gone away." "Yes, I left the same day. We've just been talking of your horse. I congratulate you," said Levin. "It was very rapidly run." "Yes. You've race horses, too, haven't you?" "No, my father had. But I remember and know something about it." "Where have you dined?" asked Stepan Arkadyevitch. "We were at the second table behind the columns." "We've been celebrating his success," said the tall colonel. "It's his second imperial prize. I wish I might have the luck at cards he has with horses. Well, why waste the precious time? I'm going to the infernal regions," added the colonel, and he walked away. "That's Yashvin," Vronsky said in answer to Turovtsin, and he sat down in the vacated seat beside them. He drank the glass offered him and offered a bottle of wine. Under the influence of the club atmosphere, or the wine he had drunk, Levin chatted away to Vronsky of the best breeds of cattle, and was very glad not to feel the slightest hostility to this man. He even told him, among other things, that he had heard from his wife that she had met him at Princess Maria Borisovna's. "Ah, Princess Maria Borisovna, she's exquisite," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, and he told an anecdote about her which set them all laughing. Vronsky particularly laughed with such simple-hearted amusement that Levin felt quite reconciled to him. "Well, have we finished?" said Stepan Arkadyevitch, getting up with a smile. "Let us go." End of chapter 7. Whew, all right. The last of the social events, maybe, but now are they going to another location? It's too many socials. But this seems to be the one that Levin feels the most comfortable. He's surrounded by people that he has easy conversation with. They're laughing. He realizes that he is starving, and so he is eating up all the food. He's having, glasses of wine, glasses of champagne. He is enjoying self, which actually he wasn't quite sure. Well, Kitty wasn't quite sure because now she knows what the type of people Oblonsky hang out with, and it is just littered with women and alcohol. For shame. So Levin's having a good time, and such a good time even that when Vronsky comes over, he doesn't have any hostility towards him. He is able to talk to him about his horses, about cattle, about, whatever, and it's easy conversation, which is wonderful. Yeah, and that's where it ends. And now, apparently, now that they've finished dinner, they're going to go to another location, which, shall we count them off, is before the concert, after the concert, now this one, and now another one, maybe a fifth one? That's too many. That is far too many. And no Uber? Wow. Yeah. I don't know, man. This is definitely a different feel than the last one, which is really cool, because the last part was very I don't know, it was just so slow. And now that at least we're having social events that are actually happening and things like that, I feel like we are going to, and now that we've seen Vronsky out in social situations, I think it's going to be also interesting to get Anna again to be like, oh, he's doing all of these things without me. He's going to leave me, which I think is also interesting because Levin has a very different relationship with Vronsky, because a little reminder, Levin proposed to Kitty first. Kitty said no, thinking that Vronsky was going to ask her, and then Vronsky didn't. And then she was like, woe is me, I need to flee to the country. And now Levin and Kitty are married. But yeah, that's going to be it for today. We done did it. But yes, it was a pleasure. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate each and every one of you. As always, whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1000% appreciate you. And I 1000% appreciate your support. If I don't see you next time, I hope to see you very soon. Bye.